Still talking about national budget and budget at large, I'm joined by Andrew Maud. Andrew is the head of regional integration for United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, at East Africa office here in Kigali, based in Kigali. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us.
You're most welcome.
You had the budget reading today in Kigali at the Parliament. What do you make of the government spending plan in the year 2020-2021?
Well, I think Minister of Finance, Dr. Njagimana, has been quite bold in terms of keeping spending at quite a reasonable level. The budget represents a 7% increase over last year's budget. And I think some economists were advising countries in the region to actually reduce expenditure, but that's the last thing you really want to do in a crisis of this nature with the COVID-19 problems and the difficulties we'll have going forward with revenues this year. So I think the minister's been quite bold and addressing some of the priorities over the short to mid-term while trying to maintain the targets to reach the national strategy for transformation goals. So, I think it's a good step forward.
Mm-hmm. We've also seen economic transformation taking about 55.5% of the national cake. Is that too much or too little?
And government's priorities, I think, to maintain, the investments in the long-term goals and developmental objectives. So, I think that's to be welcome. Where they're increasing the budget is in areas such as health spending, for example, economic recovery fund there to help businesses get out of this very difficult period. And I think, that it's right to cater to those needs because clearly the economy is going through quite a difficult time over this, particularly over this second quarter of the year. But they're still keeping their eyes on the long-term developmental goals, which is to be welcome, I think.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about regional budgets. East African governments have been accumulating debts in the recent days to finance economic recovery and COVID-19 response measures. How do you see that affecting the growth of regional economy?
Well, it's inevitable to some extent, isn't it? In the budget that the minister just presented, for example, the government's estimating a decline in revenues this year of around 9 or 10%. And that goes across the region. For all countries in the region, a lot of their economic activities have been very badly affected by this crisis. But deficits will go up. And so will government debt over this period. There's no doubt about that. The largest absolute debt in the region, of course, is Kenya. The Kenyan economy is the largest economy as well. And they reckon that it's going to go in the region of 68% of GDP this year because of the decline in revenues on the one hand and increase in expenditures related to tackling this crisis. If you put it in a global context, it's a global problem, and you're going to find debt levels going up across the board globally. And in some high-income countries, you see debt to GDP ratios well above 100%. I think the one challenge for our region is the capacity to pay back, of course, this debt. And I am concerned about trends in regional trade that we see currently. Intra-regional trade has been particularly badly affected by this crisis. So governments need to be mindful, of their ability to be able to pay back debt, and that requires maintaining export revenues.
Yeah, talking about paying back, we are seeing the biggest share of biggest share of budgets, of course, going to social protection support and social transformation. And one wonders if that will enable governments to be able to pay back their loans.
Well, it's just a social necessity at the current time, isn't it? I think, many people across the economy, and particularly in urban areas, are struggling with the impact of this crisis. And so social protection measures across the board need to be widened. In a number of countries in our region, social protection really doesn't reach a large percentage share of the population. I think the crisis has exposed the need to expand social protection measures across the board. Likewise with health expenditures. Regional governments have tended to prioritize education because they've been thinking forward-looking, to the future about educating young people to give them the skills and the necessary know-how to join the job market. But in the current context, I think globally there's going to be an examination of priority to the health sector as well, because the consequences of not spending enough resources on health are, as we know now, there's some grave economic consequences. So we will see also attention to health spending going up across the region over the next couple of years, I would imagine.
Lastly, Andrew, what should regional governments focus on in their push for economic recovery during COVID-19 aftermath?
Well, my own area of specialization is actually in regional trade, and I do feel that this is a very important element in terms of maintaining economic growth and development in the region. And Kenya released its trade figures for April a few weeks back, and I was quite disappointed to see actually the decline in intra-regional exports at the time. And I think there have to be more efforts made to remove those barriers that have arrived because of the crisis, because clearly some countries are concerned about safety concerns of cross-border transport, but I think those issues and problems need to be resolved efficiently, and we need to keep this intra-regional trade at a very high level, above all because there's so much uncertainty currently in global markets. And our region, just on one final point, Ethan, is to point out that our region, according to the forecast from organizations like IMF, is actually forecast to bounce back quite well next year from this crisis, provided the right measures are put in place. So I think this budget is a good step forward for Rwanda, but going forward, we need to look at that long-term developmental prospects and bolster regional trade and investment.
Andrew Mould, Head of Regional Integration for United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, at East African Office. Thank you so much for your time.
You're most welcome, Ethan.
I appreciate that.